Hey British Lit, this is our summary video for chapters 1 through 8 of part 3. I'm gonna hopefully answer some of your questions. A lot of this stuff is pretty important, kind of setting up what's gonna happen next week. So, all right, so chapter 1, Darnay is traveling to France at 1792. It talks about like the King of France and how he's kind of been removed. And it talks about just how like every person traveling through France is stopped at different checkpoints, and they look at all their paperwork and stuff like that. They have this big, sorry if you could hear that. That's my dog eating. Sorry. So they have this like big slogan that they're going with, and it's liberty, equality, fraternity, or death. Kind of scary. And Charles Darnay knows. There's kind of a moment in here where it talks about like as he's going, he can see like doors closing, and he knows that until he's declared like a good citizen in Paris, he's not going to be able to go back to England. And so obviously that's a major concern for him. And it's slow going. Then he gets to a certain checkpoint and they call him an emigrant, which is someone who's like left from their country and then goes back. And it says, I'm going to send you on to Paris under an escort. And it says you must have an escort and you must pay for it. So it's kind of stressful. And he's like, an emigrant, but I'm here on my own free will. He kind of thought like it's not going to be a big deal. They're going to understand that I've been trying to help them, that kind of thing, which obviously that doesn't work out. And they call him a traitor. He says, I'm not a traitor. It says he is a traitor since the decree. They passed a decree. He didn't obviously know about this decree, but unfortunately it's a little late. It says his life is forfeit to the people. They're banishing all immigrants and condemning all to death who return. And so that's a little scary, obviously, because he had no idea. Then they say, where are the papers of this prisoner? And it kind of scares Charles Darnay with those words. Because, you know, he was just an immigrant, and then they call him a prisoner. They don't even ask him any questions, really. They call him, then Citizen Defarge shows up, and they say, is this the emigrant Evermond? This is him. How old is he? 37. Yes, he's married. She's in England. And then they assign him to a prison, La Force, and he says, like, what have I done? He says, I've come here voluntarily because I got a letter from a countryman, and it says, immigrants have no rights, Evermond. And then they hand him a paper, Defarge, and it says in secret, meaning they're not going to tell anyone he's in prison. Defarge does ask, is it you who married the daughter of Dr. Manette, once a prisoner in the Bastille that is no more? And he says, yes. In the name of that sharp female, newly born and called the guillotine, why did you come to France? And he says, it's a bad truth for you. And he says, will you help me? And Defarge says, no. Can I have some communication with the world outside? You will see. It says, I'm not to be buried there. Notice they bring around that whole buried thing again. So, it says other people have been similarly buried in worse prisons before now. So you can just kind of see what they're talking about here. And then it says, but never by me, Citizen Defarge. Like, I've never done this. Not that they seem to care. So, and he says, I need to communicate with Mr. Laurie at Tellson's Bank. Will you cause that to be done for me? It says, I will do nothing for you. That's Mr. Defarge. So, no help for him. Talks about the king is in prison at this time. But most of and all of the foreign ambassadors had left Paris. And he just had no idea that this was going to happen. It says the horrible massacres, days and nights long, which within a few rounds the clock was to set a great mark of blood into the blessed garnering time of harvest. It says the guillotine was hardly known to him or to the generality of people by name. The frightful deeds that were to be soon done were probably unimagined at the time in the brains of the doers. And it talks about just like the prison is just full of people that they've thrown in there. He can buy food. And then you kind of see Charles Darnay get a little stressed because he's thinking about Dr. Manette and the time that Dr. Manette spent in prison, and he keeps walking back and forth saying he made shoes. He made shoes. I think it just freaks him out that he's kind of in the same scenario. All right, chapter 2 goes to Tellson's bank in Paris, and just kind of the job that Mr. Lorry has to do. He's got a lot of his patrons are in prison, and it just kind of talks about like the horror that he finds when he gets to Paris. And he says, thank goodness no one near and dear to me is in this dreadful town tonight. And then the door opens and two figures show up, and it is Lucy and her father. So he's like, oh goodness, I'm so glad nobody here is here that I know. And then Lucy and her father show up. So it's just kind of a bummer. Let's see. Then the doctor says that he's hoping he can help Charles because he was in prison in France. Then they have a meeting, Mr. Lorry and the doctor. Then Mr. Lorry says they're murdering the prisons. And then just people kind of like are shouting like, long live the prisoner from the Bastille. So Dr. Manette kind of becomes a hero to the people of the revolution. And so he's hoping he can use that to help Charles. All right, chapter 3 is The Shadow. This chapter is interesting. Mr. Lorry has to be careful. He doesn't want... Esme, hey, stop that. Okay, sorry. Mr. Lorry has to be careful. He doesn't want to possibly hurt the reputation or just the bank in general by harboring the wife of an immigrant prisoner. And so he goes and tries to find her a place to stay. And Jerry keeps he has Jerry keep an eye on them. They do bring Miss Pross and little Lucy, by the way. And then the doctor writes a letter to Mr. Defarge. And it says, Charles is safe, but I cannot safely leave this place yet. I've obtained the favor that the bearer has a short note from Charles to his wife. Let the bearer see his wife. So Defarge, Madame Defarge wants to see Lucy. And let's see. They're talking about like Madame Defarge is going to see their faces to make sure she can keep them safe later. All a lie, right? We know that she's crazy, so. Then Charles wrote a letter to Lucy. It says, dearest, take courage. I'm well and your father has influence around me. You cannot answer this. Kiss our child for me. And then she turned to Madame Defarge and kissed one of the hands that knitted, which is just kind of an ironic moment. And then Lucy, though, when she touches Madame Defarge, there's something that kind of like creeps her out, kind of like an intuition kind of thing. It says she looked terrified at Madame Defarge. It says she met the lifted eyebrow and forehead with a cold, impassive stare. And they say that she wants to see them so she can protect them. They want to see the child. And Madame Defarge says, is that his child? It says, pointing her knitting needle at little Lucy as if it were the finger of fate. And it talks about the shadow of Madame Defarge and her party seemed to fall so threatening and dark on the child. It says the shadow attendant on Madame Defarge and her party seemed then to fall threatening and dark on both the mother and child. So this could be foreshadowing, but it might not be. I'm not going to tell you. But scary. And Lucy just has this bad feeling about the whole thing. And she holds on to Madame Defarge's dress and says, you'll be good to my poor husband. You will do him no harm. You will help me to see him if you can. And it says, your husband is not my business here. So it's just kind of interesting. It says, we are more afraid of you than of these others, is what Lucy says to Madame Defarge. So I think she kind of sees through it. Although it says Madame Defarge saw that as a compliment that they were afraid of her. Then she talks about just like as a wife and mother, don't you feel for me and what I'm going through? And Madame Defarge kind of loses a little bit here. And she pretty much says the wives and mothers we have been used to see since we were as little as this child and much less have not been greatly considered. She says like our husbands have been in prison. and our children have starved. And she says nobody else is cared. By the way, the vengeance also comes with Madame Defarge. It says, we have borne this a long time. And she's pretty much saying, like, I don't feel bad for you because we've had it way worse. And so, yeah, it's a little stressful. It does talk about just, you know, they have this bad feeling after she's there. Chapter 4, Dr. Manette has been gone. It says he did not return until the 4th day of his absence. There are 1,100 defenseless prisoners of both sex and all ages that had been killed by the populace. And so if you can imagine just how stressful it is for Lucy and just all of them. And they're doing this in front of everyone. They have trials, kind of. Most of the time it's just guilty, guilty, guilty. Talks about, like, the court. There's a tribunal of whom some members were asleep, some awake, some dirty with murder, some clean, some sober, and some not. So it's just not fair. Darnay is going to be brought before this court. And Dr. Manette knows he must remain in custody, but he says, like, can we keep him in a safe custody just to make sure that he's not in danger? Let's see. And it just talks about, like, the doctor and how he kind of changes his perspective on what he went through because he's hoping that he may be able to use that to help Charles and maybe others. And so he's saying, like, it wasn't just a waste in a row and I was in prison, you know, maybe this is why. And it talks about, like, he's a physician and he is using some of that, looking at different prisoners, trying to help as much as he can. Lucy cannot write to her husband at all. Let's see. It talks about the guillotine. It was the best cure for a headache. It infallibly prevented the hair from turning gray. It imparted a peculiar delicacy for the complexion. It was the national razor which shaved close. Who kissed the guillotine, looked through the little window, and sneezed into the sack. It was a sign of the regeneration of the human race. It superseded the cross. Models of it were worn on breasts from which the cross was discarded, and it was bowed down to and believed, and where the cross was denied. Because in France during this time, they completely let go of religion. They don't want anything to do with religion. And they even changed their calendar and what a week looks like for quite a while. And they just get rid of all, like, religion. For a lot of the people, especially these revolutionaries, they just don't want any part of religion. And so the guillotine kind of becomes their new symbol. I think it's really cool, the lines that he uses there. Just, you know, it's the national razor and that kind of stuff. So it says it sheared off heads so many that it and the ground it most polluted were a rotten red. And it talks about here just... it's that moment that you see the blood running through the streets instead of the wine from earlier. And it just talks about the doctor walked through all of this. He had no doubts that he would be able to save Lucy's husband. It has been 15 months. I don't know if you caught that. It says Charles had lain in prison 1 year and 3 months. So it's been 15 months that he's been in prison. Just can't imagine that. All right, chapter 5 is the wood sawyer. And it talks about, at the beginning, it describes again the guillotine. It says all daily brought into light from the dark cellars of the loathsome prisons. It talks about all red wine for the guillotine. All daily brought into light from the dark cellars of the loathsome prisons and carried to her through the streets to slake her devouring thirst. Liberty, equality, fraternity, or death. The last much the easiest to bestow, O guillotine. So it's just, you know, describing it. Lucy, for the most part, is able to hold it together, but sometimes at night she just kind of sobs and cries, and the doctor promises he's doing what he can. Then he says there's an upper window in the prison where Charles can sometimes gain access at 3 p.m. And so he says, you know, you can go there and you can wave to him. Well, he says just stand there so he can see you. Don't make a sign of recognition because, you know, you don't want to get in trouble. And so she goes and she stays there and waits every day for 2 hours. And it talks about when it was not too wet or inclement for a child to be with her, they went together. And she never misses a day. She doesn't even know if Charles can see her. But she just at least knows that maybe he can see her. And so for that hope, she keeps going. There's a man that sees them there every day. It's the wood sawyer. He's kind of a weird guy. He's like chopping wood, and it says, see my saw? I call it my little guillotine. La, 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 la. And off his head comes. It's just kind of a weird guy. And he sees her there every day. And then he says, like, he's chopping the wood, and he's like, oh, there goes her head, and there goes the little head, and all the family. And it's just like, what is happening? You know, I'd have a hard time going if that guy was creepy. And it does say her husband did see her once in every 5 or 6 times. And so she was willing to wait because she knew it probably gave him hope. Let's see. Then they're standing outside, and this like big mad mob kind of goes by, and Madame Defarge sees her there. That we find out Charles is going to be summoned tomorrow, the next day. And the doctor believes he'll be restored. Let's see. Chapter 6 is called Triumph. It says that Charles Darnay sees all these prisoners, and pretty much all of them have died as they're being taken out. There are like 16, well, it talks about like the trials, and there's like an hour and a half, and 15 people are condemned in the hour and a half, so you can just tell that there's not free, it's not fair, these court cases. Sorry, I'm going to try to hurry up. It talks about the Defarges there. They never looked towards Charles Evermond. A lot of people are calling for Charles's head. It talks about he relinquished a title that was distasteful to him. There were 2 witnesses, Gabelle and Dr. Manette. It talks about he got married in England, and they kind of think that's a betrayal, but it's like, no, I married a French woman. And she's the daughter of Dr. Manette. Let's see. Gabelle, by the way, was released because of Charles 3 days before. The doctor was questioned. The voices were in the prisoner's favor, which is very unusual back then because most people wanted blood. They didn't really care why they were being killed. Let's see. And then Lucy just kind of passes out. Well, she cries, and then they carry her up to her rooms. Okay, chapter 7 is called A Knock at the Door. It's pretty intense. Lucy is still just afraid, and the doctor just feels very proud that he was able to save Charles. Jerry Cruncher is, he's kind of like the runner. He goes to the market and stuff. The rest of them stay to the house. They have to have like their names outside of the doorpost. They add Charles Darnay. Well, they call it add Charles Evermond to the list. And Miss Pross and Jerry are the ones who go to the market. They talk about, like, can we get out of France? Can we go back to England? They know there's no way that they can take Charles at this point because it'd just be too dangerous. And they decide they must have patience and wait. And then Lucy says, I heard strange feet upon the stairs. People come in with red caps. It says that they're here to arrest Charles. And it says you're summoned for tomorrow. Dr. Manette kind of freezes. It says he's been denounced to the section of St. Antone, which is where the Defarges are from. And the doctor's like, why? And they're like, hey, if the Republic wants something, then you as, you know, a member of our group, you know, a rebel, are going to let, you know, you just have to let it go. So Dr. Manette, if he's not careful here, could get in trouble, and they could call him, you know, like a traitor and that kind of stuff. And so he has to be careful here. And he's like, well, will you tell me who like wants him back in prison, who denounced him? And it says he's denounced and gravely by the citizen and citizeness Defarge and by one other. And so we just know that the Defarges have said that they want him arrested and that there's one other person. We don't know who that other person is. All right. So then chapter 8, our last chapter, is called A Hand at Cards. And Miss Pross is in the market with Jerry, and she sees her brother Solomon. Remember, we've talked about him. He stole all of Miss Pross's money. He obviously is not a good guy. They've always wanted, or she's always wanted Lucy to marry her brother, which is just kind of crazy. All right, then Jerry sees him, and he says, I know you're John Barsad. So Miss Pross's brother changed his name and has been John Barsad this whole time. So remember the person who spoke against Charles at the beginning? Miss Pross's brother. Notice how I said that he uses a lot of coincidences to come back around. That's one of them. It says you were a spy witness at the Bailey, John Barsad. And, well, he just says, Jerry says John, and then Sidney Carton shows up and says Barsad. So there's like, what? Sidney Carton's here. All right, so it says, let's see, that John Barsad works in the prisons. I don't know if you guys caught that. He's a spy, but he's working in the prisons. And they want him to go back to Tellson's Bank. They want to have an audience, like discuss some things with him. Barsad is the one who told the Defarges we know about Charles and Lucy. He says he'll go with him. All right. Then it says Darnay has been arrested again. Sidney tells Mr. Lorry because Mr. Lorry didn't know that. And it's a little worrisome that the doctor wasn't able to prevent that arrest. And so that's obviously a stressful thing for all of them. Let's see. Then it talks about just John Barsad, and they're playing cards. It's a metaphor, obviously, too. They're playing cards, and, you know, there's a card not to be beaten. Look over your hand and see what you have. Don't hurry. So this is a game between John Barsad and Sidney Carton. It says the spy was fearful. Let's see. I'm trying to think if there's other things. John Barsad always remembers that terrible woman that had knitted when he talked with her. So he always remembers Madame Defarge, which is a little scary. It says she produced her knitted registers and denounced people whose lives the guillotine then surely swallowed up. He knew, as everyone employed as he was did, that he was never safe, that flight was impossible. He knows he can't leave, and he also knows that his life is at risk. And so he's a little worried about that. And so he knows that like one word could bring all of this down upon his head. And he also knows that, like, you know, Sidney Carton could turn him in. So let's see. Then he says, whatever happened to Cly, you know, he was also a witness, and he was like, oh, he's been dead several years. And it says there was, Mr. Lorry becomes aware of a goblin shadow on the wall, and it's Mr. Cruncher. And he says, John Barsad says, I'll lay before you a certificate of Cly's burial. It's not a forgery. Mr. Cruncher comes forward and says, so you put him in his coffin, like you made sure he was buried? And he says, I did. And Jerry says, who took him out of it? And so remember, Jerry Cruncher, the grave robber, went to the graveyard, and we know something didn't work out well for him that night, but we don't know what. And we find out when he opened that grave, when he opened the casket, I can't think, There was no body in there. And so he's like, so who took the body out? And he's like, what do you mean? He wasn't never in it. And the spy looks around the two gentlemen. They both look in unspeakable astonishment at Jerry because obviously Mr. Lorry doesn't know he's a grave robber. Neither does Sydney. Sydney had no idea that Jerry was going to know this information, which helps him, you know, in the end. It gives him an extra card for the metaphor. It gives him like the upper hand. It says, I tell you, you buried paving stones and earth in that there coffin. It was a take-in, meaning it was a fake. They just put rocks and stuff in there. And so then Sidney Carton says he has obviously a higher card, a certain guillotine card. Do you play? And John is like, no. Let's see. And then he is a turnkey at the concierge. I can't say that word. Sorry. Conciergerie or something like that. Pretty much he has the keys at prison sometimes. And so Sidney Carton says he wants to have a discussion with him in a dark room alone, and that's all we know. So that is the end of chapter 8. Yeah, so we are almost there. And the next few chapters get so good. I hope you guys enjoy it. So don't forget, we do have a, whatever it's called, a Zoom meeting tomorrow. So at 2 o'clock.